26 million dead, 40 million infected, and a continent, Africa, devastated. In 20 years, AIDS has become the worst medical catastrophe ever experienced by humankind.
100 million people in the next 50 years are going to die of HIV disease prematurely. It's not a disease like cancer of old people. It's a disease of young people. And it's one of the great human tragedies of all time. The West has ignored it. Ronald Reagan ignored it. George Bush Sr. ignored it. Bill Clinton ignored it. And it has spread and spread and spread and spread. And so we are facing a human tragedy of incredible proportions.
No one knows how AIDS first appeared. Like all diseases, unless we understand its origins, we have little hope of finding a cure or a vaccine.
We're not going to be able to hide from this one, okay? Some have said, look, this is just not going to go away. And it's just human nature. It's a historical question. You could say it's almost not scientific. When you've got something of this importance, the mind just says, well, where did it come from?
The origins of AIDS remains a mystery about which the scientific community has long kept silent. Lack of interest or fear of knowing? Yet isolated voices have dared to question and attempted to break the silence. Following the footsteps of a few dedicated men to where it all began, Africa, we were able to locate some of the places and people involved in the genesis of this terrible human tragedy. HIV, the contributing virus of AIDS, was first isolated in 1983 by Luc Montagnier and Françoise Barré-Sinoussy's teams at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. Simon Wain-Hobson was among them.
When this first came, people thought that this bomb from nowhere necessitated sort of novel explanations. And no one really knew. There was no cousin, if you wish, to this sort of virus known in the animal kingdom at that point.
But this cousin did exist, and in 1989 researchers identified it in one animal, the chimpanzee. They named it SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, analogous to HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. The similarities between the two viruses prompted researchers to designate SIV as the ancestor of HIV. But how did SIV become HIV and infect man?
Chimpanzees are very similar to humans, as you know. Their genetic components are very similar to ours. And one would think if you took HIV and injected it into a chimp, that they would develop AIDS. But the interesting thing is that they don't. It's one of the most fascinating items that I know in science today. They don't get infected with HIV, they get well. Now, why don't humans do this? Why is it that you can take a chimpanzee and inject them with a large amount of HIV? The chimp will go through a period in which he has circulating HIV in his blood. He will develop antibodies just as humans will. And then the HIV disappears. And you can't find it anymore. So from that point of view, chimps are absolutely fascinating.
And the immediate precursor to the virus that's going around the world is chimpanzees. We're all agreed on that. We can discuss when, why, how, but we all agree on the chimpanzee. So when, I think there's a consensus to say it's this century. Where, clearly, the epicenter in humans is the northeast Zaire, Uganda. The epidemic sort of started from there.
During the 1950s, this region, Zaire, was called the Belgian Congo. Blood samples were collected here in 1959 by an American researcher and a Belgian physician, Joseph Vandepitte.
J'ai écrit avec Motulski, après avoir fait le tour du Congo, en incluant certaines parties donc, du Rwanda et du Burundi. Et nous avons prélevé presque 2000 sérums d'adultes. Et c'est beaucoup plus tard qu'il les a donnés à des experts pour voir s'il n'y avait pas de traces de HIV. Or, il y a un laboratoire qui a trouvé un seul sérum séropositif et ça a été confirmé par plusieurs autres laboratoires. Et je crois que dans la littérature en général, on considère ça le premier sérum séropositif pour le sida avant l'ère du sida. Le numéro était L70 et elle vient de Léopoldville.
We have the date, 1959, and the place, Leopoldville, former capital of the Belgian Congo, today known as Kinshasa. The first evidence of AIDS emerged from Central Africa more than 20 years before the rise of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in America.
So if you went back and said, well, HIV is related to SIV, to the monkey AIDS virus, where do humans have contact with monkeys? Well, the average person has no contact with monkeys. There are only two ways that you can have contact with monkeys that I can figure. One is you have people who eat monkeys, and in so doing, they clean the monkey and with a sharp knife or a dull knife or what have you, and can become infected that way. The other way is that we used vaccines that were made from monkeys that we injected into people.
The AIDS virus can only be transmitted through contact with blood or mucosa. Most in the scientific community favor the hunter theory, which suggests the occurrence of an accident during which man could have become infected with contaminated chimpanzee blood. However, this theory fails to explain why AIDS appeared so recently, when chimpanzees have been hunted across Africa for thousands of years. But there exists another, more disturbing theory. In 1992, an independent journalist, Tom Curtis, published an article with unexpected consequences.
I had a source in California, an AIDS treatment activist, who sent me a packet of clips one day saying, this is a bombshell story waiting for an investigative reporter. What I had been sent was a couple of documents saying, well, it's all very well and good to talk about these bizarre tribal rituals or other possible explanations of the cause of AIDS, but it is a fact that the virus, the monkey virus SV40, was transmitted to millions of people across the world. And they sort of planted the suggestion that something similar might have happened with AIDS.
This revelation was a bombshell. Tom Curtis speculated that if during the 50s polio vaccines were contaminated with the monkey virus SV40, Something similar could have happened with AIDS. SIV, the ancestor of the AIDS virus, is also a monkey virus. And Curtis connected this fact to a mass polio vaccination campaign in the Congo.
It looked at the polio campaign that Dr. Kaprowski had undertaken in the former Belgian Congo in the middle to late 1950s. And I did focus on that campaign because of certain geographic similarities to where scientists were saying AIDS had begun in the human population, which was in this same region.
And this particular region of Africa is the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic. Curtis's hypothesis jolted the scientific community because it implicated one of its own, Hilary Kaprowski, a renowned researcher and pioneer in the fight against polio.
There was a tremendous feeling in the scientific community that they were somehow endangered. If you had journalists writing articles in the Rolling Stone, my God, what about our dignity? So there was a lot of concern from that viewpoint. There was a lot of concern that it was written by a person who was a professional journalist, and that they were afraid that people would no longer immunize their children against polio.
How could a simian virus possibly contaminate a vaccine? Curtis's argument was extremely serious because it put in question the manufacturing of polio vaccine, one of modern medicine's greatest triumphs. To understand what could have happened, we have to return to the polio years. In 1958, America was beginning to recover from a scourge that had haunted it for more than 50 years, polio. The disease, still incurable at the time, paralyzed and killed, mostly children. "90 million Americans were vaccinated in one of the largest mass vaccination campaigns ever. Polio vaccine, one of modern medicine's greatest successes, made its inventor, Jonas Salk, a hero.
All 164 million Americans, to say nothing of all the other people in the world, will profit from your discovery. I am very, very happy to hand that to you.
But polio vaccine had one distinctive feature. It was the first to be derived from monkey organs. Mass commercialization began and gave rise to the development of an enormous market for monkeys, used both as test animals and as raw material from which to create the polio vaccine. Entire shipments of macaque arrived in America from India and the Philippines.
To make primary cultures of monkey kidneys, you needed monkey kidneys, you needed flasks or bottles, you needed culture medium, and this was usually supplemented with fetal calf serum or with horse serum, which was used extensively, and you were in business. One obtains a piece of tissue, and then one divides it. And the way you divide it is you, first of all, in the crudest sense, you take a pair of scissors and you snip, 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 snip until you have a suspension of cells that is relatively crude. That is, there are lumps and bumps in there. Put them into the flasks, let them settle down and make a monolayer of cells, add poliovirus, and then you would collect the liquid from the cultures, filter out the cells, remove the cell remains, and then you would have a virus suspension. Then you could kill it with formaldehyde, put it into bottles, and call it polio vaccine. That was it. So trying to get entirely pure cultures as primary cultures is very difficult. You can have a culture of monkey kidney cells that looks to be very pure, but if you look at those on the surface, or if you stain them, or you look with a special microscope, you can see that there are other cell types present in there.
And other viruses could have infected these other cells. Driven to eradicate one disease, we risked creating another. Scientists and governmental organizations knew this. The powerful Food and Drug Administration was aware of the risks, but kept the information hidden.
It was the researcher, Bernice Eddy, at the Food and Drug Administration who first had indications that these viruses existed, and her findings were essentially suppressed. There was a lot of inner discussion within FDA of her taking examples of mouse tumors to her supervisors, and they're seemingly being biased against the possibility that this could be a nasty virus. She did, however, present her work at a New York meeting, to which again she was criticized for doing that. Subsequently, Dr. Sweet and Dr. Hillerman found the same virus, having heard about it, and named it SV40.
During this same period, the terminology for these monkey viruses was established and published in the medical literature. SV40 was only the 40th virus in a very long list.
We should have stopped using monkey kidney tissues, I think, for virus production in 1960. And we've continued to do so. The drug companies are the ones who really determine this. They have developed facilities, they develop processes that would cost them a lot of money if they had to do it a different way. The thing that makes me physically angry is the fact that we now have the genetic ability to make synthetic polio vaccine from recombinant proteins, and we are not doing it. We continue to take ground up monkey parts and inject them into children.
Using monkeys to manufacture vaccines was and still remains dangerous. Curtis's basis for his theory was correct. Polio vaccines at the time were contaminated with a monkey virus. But that didn't explain the appearance of AIDS. Curtis proposed that Kaprowski made his vaccine using a monkey other than the macaque, the African green monkey. But this was a mistake. The African green monkey does carry an SIV, but this is not the direct ancestor of HIV-1, our AIDS virus.
Hilary Kaprowski felt that his honor had been defiled and that he had been done serious injury. The Rolling Stone folded under and publicly apologized for having published the article. And that was, as they say, that for the time being.
I thought, people should think for themselves and evaluate the evidence, decide. And mostly, I thought they should simply test the vaccine to find out whether this theory had merit or not, because theories are the way scientific knowledge advances. And even theories that turn out not to be true help advance scientific knowledge. So I felt it was a legitimate question, and I felt a little bit under siege by the medical community and some in the science press and so on, who were acting like I was an apostate,
Hilary Kaprowski, the man Curtis had attacked, is a well-known and respected scientist, a pioneer of research into rabies and polio. He is also an expert on cancer and AIDS. Back in the polio years, Hilary Kaprowski was a young Polish researcher. Brilliant and ambitious, he was determined to make a name for himself in his newly adopted country, the USA. In 1950, he secretly tested his first prototype of a live oral polio vaccine on 20 handicapped children at Letchworth Village in New York State. When the scientific community learned that Hilary Kaprowski was experimenting on human beings, it was a scandal, even though the test was deemed to have done no harm. The community's condemnation of Kaprowski's secret research led to the loss of official support for his work, with preference shifting to Jonas Salk's injected polio vaccine. But Kaprowski refused to quit. With the support of a large pharmaceutical company, Lederle, he proceeded to test different versions of his oral polio vaccine on small groups of human subjects. 52 at Sonoma, 53 at Letchworth Village, 54 at Woodbine, and 55 at Clinton Farms. A tragic event lent him unexpected support. On April the 23rd, 1955, 260 children injected with Salk's vaccine became sick. 11 died. The investigation showed that some of the Salk vaccine lots were defective. Confidence in Salk's injected vaccine was shaken, clearing the way for Kaprowski to assert himself. But he was now no longer alone. Another scientific giant, Albert Sabin, announced his intention to develop an attenuated live vaccine.
On the one hand, you had Albert Sabin, who looked on this as an enormous challenge. On the other hand, Hilary approached it from the standpoint that yes, this was a challenge. Yes, this was a medical problem. Yes, it was going to be interesting to solve it. And yes, we'll go off and do it by whatever means that are available to us, that are legal. So you have these two conflicting individuals who are all working towards the same goal. And it's one of the great dramas of modern times of how they interacted and how they worked. They were willing to go and take subjects who may or may not have been informed of what they were doing. They were willing to go to the backside of the moon if it meant that they could find out whether or not they had a viable product.
To win this race, they have to test. And to test, they need the largest possible population of non-immunized people, something no longer available in America. The first to prove the reliability and safety of his vaccine will be the winner. Sabin makes a secret deal with his native country, the USSR, where he will vaccinate more than 6 million people in Latvia, Estonia, and Kazakhstan. Kaprowski chooses an African country, the Belgian Congo, a long-standing possession of King Leopold and the jewel of his colonial empire. Because of the Congo's uranium mines, commercial accords had existed between America and Belgium since the Second World War. This was also a country with one of Africa's best organized and most modern healthcare infrastructures.
L'Institut Princesse Astrid est un des laboratoires médicaux les plus importants et les plus complets de l'Afrique centrale. Il dispose d'un personnel nombreux et d'un matériel ultramoderne, tant pour l'exécution des analyses courantes que pour la recherche scientifique et la préparation de vaccins et sérums utilisés dans la lutte contre diverses maladies infectieuses. La sollicitude des services officiels s'étend spécialement aux enfants, l'avenir même du pays. Dès l'école, tous les enfants sont soumis à des examens médicaux et à cette occasion reçoivent un carnet de santé, véritable fiche d'identité sanitaire.
The efficient organization of medical records made the local population extremely suitable for experimentation.
Returned to political quiet after the recent disturbances, Leopoldville engages in an all-out fight against infantile paralysis, crowding every clinic with mothers and their children, the latter to receive orally administered shots of a new vaccine against the scourge of childhood. It is a live virus preparation developed in the United States by Philadelphia's Dr. Hilary Koprovsky, and it differs from our famed Salk vaccine in that it does away with injections. And it must taste good if the children's receptivity to it is a criterion.
Hilary Koprovsky went to the Congo and took people who had been abused, mistreated, and had been the victims of, if you want to put it that way, of colonial expansion for nearly 100 years, and used them. The ethics of that, I don't think, occurred to anyone at the time. The opportunity was there, it was legal, it was allowed by the Belgian government. They went in and did their job, and that was it. No big deal.
Sabin and Koprovsky conducted their experiments at the same time with the same type of vaccine. No AIDS cases were detected in Russia, but in the Congo the first known HIV infections surfaced a couple of years after the start of the vaccinations. Was it coincidental, or was there, as Curtis suggested, something different with Koprovsky's vaccine? To get a definitive answer, Curtis had tried to get the vaccine used in the Congo tested, something Cecil Fox had wanted to do in 1985.
When I went to the Food and Drug Administration as a government employee to ask if I could obtain early lots of polio vaccine to test for the presence of sequences or presence of viruses in them, I was told that they didn't exist. Well, I was told they did exist, but something happened, and then they didn't exist. And they were unavailable to me. I could not get them. I could not find them. There was no way I could go through and find out what they had in their freezers. I was told by other people that all of that work had already been done, and it was not true. Now, I had to take that on faith. I did not believe them. So, because I work for the government, I had to kind of let it stay where it was. I could not pursue it more energetically.
Why wasn't Cecil Fox able to gain access to the Congo polio samples? Maybe because, in 1958, Albert Sabin analysed Koprovsky's vaccine, called Chat, and found it to be unstable and contaminated by an unknown virus, which he called Virus X. He told Koprovsky about the findings. The response was immediate. Dear Albert, I have carefully considered your extraordinary letter of November 17th, with its even more extraordinary enclosures. Like you, I am trying to put myself in your position, but I cannot imagine for a moment that I would dismiss 10 years of work by another investigator with one airy wave of an intraspinal needle. I am also sure that you are familiar with the maxim of La Rochefoucauld, le querelle ne durerait pas longtemps si le tort n'était que d'un côté. Sabin replied, Sir, your letter of December 1st does not merit a reply. It is clear that dispassionate analysis and discourse are impossible with you. Sarcasm and invectives do not take the place of reproducible facts in science. Farewell, my one-time friend and colleague. Koprovsky's Chat vaccine was, therefore, less safe than claimed and possibly even contaminated. Sabin decided to make his findings public. In June 1960, his vaccine, deemed more reliable, was chosen to replace Salk's. Koprovsky lost the race, but ironically Sabin's vaccine wasn't perfect either. Like Salk's, it was contaminated by the macaque monkey virus, SV40. The story could have ended there, but one man decided to pick up the investigation. Like Tom Curtis, Edward Hooper was a freelance writer. He decided to travel to Africa to follow the path of the polio vaccinations. He was convinced that there he would find answers to his questions. His research spanned 17 years. He accumulated hours of interviews with the major players and scientists of the period. Hooper also read and gathered thousands of documents. He drafted a precise list of cities and villages in which the chat polio vaccine had been administered, and those from which the first AIDS cases and HIV infections had emerged. In 1999, Hooper finally published the results of his research in a book of more than 1,000 pages. The River.
Good evening. Could AIDS have been accidentally caused by scientists? A new book claims HIV has its origins in apes and monkeys and was passed on to humans when scientists in Africa used primate tissue in a mass vaccination campaign against polio. I'll be asking the book's author whether his allegations stand up.
AIDS came about as an act of man, not as an act of God. An experimental oral polio vaccine that was prepared, I believe, in chimpanzee kidneys and chimpanzee blood, and which was fed to over 1 million Africans in the Belgian Congo, in Rwanda, and in Burundi between 1957 and 1960, correlates so precisely with the first appearances of AIDS that I think what we have here is the route whereby this chimpanzee virus arrived in humans. The incredible, remarkable correlation between the places where chat vaccine was fed in Central Africa and the first appearances of HIV and AIDS.
Like Tom Curtis, Hooper affirmed that Kaprowski's chat vaccine was quite different from other polio vaccines. But for Hooper, the primate used to create the vaccine was not the African green monkey, but the chimpanzee, the animal host to the immediate ancestor of HIV-1. Was this the resolution of the mystery of the origin of AIDS? The book created a new scandal. Science and Hilary Kaprowski, the creator of the vaccine, were again put in question.
Along came the book by Ed Hooper, The River, which did a much more scholarly, but Ed Hooper was also a journalist. Another journalist had come and taken a shot at these great giants of science.
The intensity of the debate and the precision of the accusations forced Hilary Kaprowski to respond.
The tissue which I used were kidneys obtained either monkeys from Philippines or from India, which was rhesus monkey. This is the normal term, and there are two other species, Macaca mulata, I forgot the name of the species from Philippines. And this is documented in print.
So you never used chimpanzees to...
Oh, never in my life.
It is odd and unfortunate that no accurate documents exist on how Kaprowski made his chat vaccine in the 1950s. But where memory fails, archive footage from the colonial period might shed light.
Au Congo belge, le camp de Polio, dirigé par le docteur Courtois, compte 86 chimpanzés sur lesquels on pratique régulièrement des essais en injectant le vaccin anti-polio inventé en 1947 par le docteur Kaprowski. Les animaux sont placés dans des cages dont une des parois est mobile et permet d'approcher plus facilement les singes pour les injections hypodermiques. Ainsi se poursuit une lutte implacable contre une des plus terribles maladies non encore vaincues.
The extraordinary thing is why they carried out this work at all. Because by this stage it was well known that chimpanzees are in fact an extremely poor barometer of vaccine safety. Albert Sabin, who was the other great maker of live polio vaccines at that time, had demonstrated from 1955 onwards that the animals which needed to be used to test the safety of polio vaccines by injecting either into the spine or into the brain. It was either intraspinal or intracerebral inoculation. And he had demonstrated that the animals that you need to use for that are lower monkeys. Normally, it was macaques from India or from the Philippines that were used. And it tells you very little, in fact, if you carry out such tests on chimpanzees.
In the heart of the Congo, Kaprowski had created a research camp housing only one species of primate, the chimpanzee. Over 4 years, the camp would accommodate several hundred chimps, making it one of the largest chimpanzee colonies ever created. What were they all used for?
Well over 400 chimpanzees were brought to Lindy Camp in the space of less than 2 years, between 1956 and 1958, and that with 1 or 2 notable exceptions, animals which were favourites, which were treated as pets, that every single one of these chimpanzees ended up dead. The question has to be, why were they killed? And it seems now that they were killed as a source of blood and of tissues, some of which were sent abroad, of that we have evidence, and some of which were sent to the medical laboratory of Stanleyville.
The strength of the evidence gathered by Hooper obliged scientists to take positions. But in the upcoming battle, Hooper was not alone. He had an ally, a renowned scientist, considered the most important evolutionary biologist since Darwin, Bill Hamilton. Hamilton believed that immensely powerful medical and pharmaceutical interests play a huge role in science. Because these institutions are preoccupied with ever greater profits, scientists bear the responsibility to guard against potential dangers to society that they might find in the course of their research.
The idea that this great triumph, and it certainly was a wonderful triumph of defeating polio, was accompanied by a disaster as big as AIDS, and obviously it knocks you off your plinth of success to have to admit that this even might have happened, let alone that it actually did happen. And I seem to encounter this every time I talk to people who are connected with medical science. They just don't want to hear about this theory.
Is there a possibility here scientists simply don't want to know, don't want to accept perhaps at least the moral, if not the legal liability for what has been done, for the AIDS virus?
I feel that this is so, and as one of the most worrying aspects of the case, I feel it's not only the origin of AIDS that is in question here, it is the conduct of science towards this hypothesis, which has been one of almost paranoid rejection, I would say. I think I would not exaggerate to describe it as medical science's worst hated hypothesis, and there seems to be a great reluctance to publish anything about it or to test any of the available evidence that could be more directly tested.
For Bill Hamilton, there was a 95% possibility that the theory would prove valid, so he decided to leave for the Congo with Ed Hooper to follow up on the chimpanzees. In a letter he sent to the British Science Academy, the prestigious Royal Society, he wrote,
"It's inspired by the extraordinary fact that despite a very plausible hypothesis that the human version of the AIDS virus first took off in humans from chimpanzees in exactly the Upper Congo area, no one has been there to collect samples for analysis for SIVs, but we hope to collect and bring back feces in alcohol from as many chimps and bonobos as we can approach.
Bill Hamilton returned to the Congo to collect samples. During that second visit, he contracted malaria and died in March 2000.
He went to Africa. He died because of his second trip to Africa. What was he doing his second trip to Africa? Collecting chimpanzee stools, because we know that you can get from chimpanzee stools, you can amplify out genetic material. And this was a way of, because you're not allowed to shoot chimpanzees for, obviously, I mean, and this is the substitute, so you're getting chimp shit. Look, you can say Bill Hammond was ethereal, he was, had these odd ideas, he was this and he was that. But what was the guy doing? Collecting data. Data collecting. So he knew very well that maybe it was, you could say it was a wacky theory, it was a possible idea, and he knew the only way to resolve it was by getting data. So you have this remarkable sort of figure who comes up with some wacky ideas, comes up with some brilliant ideas, bigger scientist than I. But what was he doing? Scientific method.
Before his trip to Africa, Hamilton had asked the Royal Society to stage a debate on the origins of AIDS. After he died, Robin Weiss and Simon Wain-Hobson, the remaining co-organizers, decided to go ahead with the conference. The scientific stakes were huge. There would be a chance for a debate between the supporters of the cut-hunter theory and oral polio vaccine theory. It would be the first time in the history of the Royal Society that a non-scientist was allowed to debate with some of the most respected experts in their fields.
When I arrived at the conference that morning, I was feeling quite nervous, I freely admit. I didn't know what to expect. I never even attended a scientific conference of this type before. So I walked in there with my sheaths of notes and my speech prepared, and I had made a decision before I arrived that if the theory was fairly dealt with by the scientific community, that at the end of the conference, if I had the opportunity, I was going to stand up from the floor and commend the scientists present on their openness and honesty, and say that I felt at this stage it was time for me, as an investigator who was originally a journalist back in the 80s, to withdraw from the debate, to make the materials that I collected available to the scientists if they wish to use them, but to withdraw from the debate and leave it to them to take it from there.
And why is the theory so hated? Well, most of all, of course, because it suggests the West gave Africa AIDS. But its critics say it also undermines confidence in vaccination, so it jeopardizes the campaign to eradicate polio. It blackens the reputation of a man hailed as a hero, Hilary Kaprowski. And it also shows how dangerous animal viruses can be, and that threatens research on using animal organs for human transplants.
I am not to defend myself. Hooper has to defend himself. Certainly this meeting is very welcome. I think it's a good meeting. It's an unusual meeting. That a journalist presents a hypothesis without facts, and here come the scientists and give him all the scientific facts.
We needed simply to get the protagonists together. This means get the protagonists together, not have some sort of whitewash where you get sort of discuss it. You get the people, get Kaprowski and Hooper in the same room, exchanging comments.
I think we're going to have a real debate today. I think it's going to be a worthwhile debate. I don't think it's between Kaprowski and myself. I think it's about something far more important than that.
To whom?
To Hooper, to Ed Hooper.
I'm not talking to him, I'm talking to the audience of Horel.
When Hooper arrived at the conference, he did not know that the die had already been cast.
And we did that OPV conference against huge amount of criticism from our colleagues. Huge amount of criticism from our colleagues. But I think that it lanced the abscess, and I don't think Hooper could prove his case. And I think our subsequent work shows that it doesn't fit, but it could have. Robin was right, it was a close shave, but it didn't work.
From the start of the conference, arguments were piled up against Hooper's theory. Even the date HIV emerged among humans was challenged, with theoretical calculations that it already existed in 1931, long before the Congo vaccinations took place. But the final blow was an announcement that samples of chat vaccine had been located, tested, and contained no trace of HIV, SIV, or chimp DNA. The conclusions were final, and left little room for Hooper to respond.
Mr. Hooper has used the word smoking guns. There is no gun, there is no bullet, there is no shooter, there is no motive, there is only smoke created by Mr. Hooper.
I think the smokescreen that has appeared today has been a smokescreen from the people who made the vaccine.
This dramatic turn of events had eliminated the oral polio vaccine theory from the scientific debate on the origins of AIDS.
This did offend Ed Hooper, because he was clearly the underdog at the meeting. But science is a very cruel culture. We go by evidence, and although we may be fooled in our interpretation, we may fool ourselves in misinterpreting evidence. In the end, hard evidence wins the day.
Science is not democratic in that respect. It's not like, well, you have your opinion and I have mine, and we agree to differ. In science, you have your theory and I have my hypothesis, but if I can kill your hypothesis, I can kill your hypothesis. Your hypothesis doesn't exist. I can wipe it out. It's not appreciated enough. Scientists are making hypotheses every day, and they're breaking them. We call it hypothesis breaking. Hypothesis making and hypothesis breaking. And we break more hypotheses than we make.
But the scientific evidence that signalled the death knell for the polio vaccine theory still needed to be re-examined. Exactly what was tested?
The actual samples that were used in the Congo between late 1957 and the beginning of 1960, of course, don't exist anymore. They were used. But one of the samples tested was the very same lot of virus as Hooper thinks is by far the most likely to have been contaminated that was used in the Congo, the chat 10A11.
Are these really the same samples?
And this was discovered here in the UK, who had received it in 1981 from the State Serum Institute in Stockholm, who in turn had received it from the Wistar Institute around the time it was made. And it was sealed and had never been opened.
The very organiser of the Royal Society Conference admits that samples of the chat vaccine used in the Congo no longer exist. So for this sample that remained sealed since it was made in Kaprowski's laboratory, all one can say for certain is that it was never used in the Congo. In all scientific rigour, how can it be used as the decisive proof against the oral polio vaccine theory?
This was another event in which the scientists eventually conjoined and had a public lynching in London for the Royal Society, in which they once again claimed to have laid rest to the idea that HIV could have come from polio vaccine. And I don't think they did a better job than they had done before. There are still great gaping holes in their story.
Be that as it may, science rarely admits being wrong. And that is exactly what Bill Hamilton was afraid of. In his letter sent to the Royal Society a year earlier, he wrote, "Through failure to find the truth, to publicise and to study what happened, the potential result is that medical science will continue unheeding towards equal, if not considerably greater, disasters." At the Royal Society, scientists didn't see a shred of evidence for the oral polio vaccine theory. Is it so easy to dismiss a theory that disturbs? In his book, Hooper also implicated the Belgian colony, in particular the Stanleyville Medical Laboratory and its research team. Only one of them, Paul Osterrieth, came to the Royal Society. There he testified that the polio vaccine could never have been prepared in Stanleyville. Why was it impossible? To answer this question, key to Ed Hooper's theory, we decided to return to the Congo and to Stanleyville and look for witnesses from the lab and Camp Lindy. The former capital of the Oriental provinces is now called Kisangani. It is a city ravaged by years of dictatorship and war since independence in 1960. On the outskirts of Kisangani, an immense building stands before us. This is all that remains of the Stanleyville Medical Laboratory. It was the last of a new generation of laboratories built in the Congo 3 years before independence. Their responsibilities were ambitious for the times and for a colony. In a 1957 document from the Belgian medical authorities, we even discover that vaccine research and production was part of their duties. To understand the link between the medical lab and the Lindy experimentation camp, we went to the only witness Hooper had found during his research, Christophe Eyrolle. Eyrolle agreed to guide us to the remains of the camp. The camp was built 15 kilometers downstream from Stanleyville, on a tributary of the Congo River, the Lindy River. To get there, you had to take a ferry that no longer exists. Eyrolle was 16 when he was hired, at the very opening of the camp. He was in charge of the care and feeding of the chimpanzees.
Yes, this is the metal which remained after the construction of the hangar. Is there an hangar bonio?
Mibale.
2 hangars. One hangar was here, another was there. They were two.
Mio solo qua kubana musala te suka na go zera 600 sponge.
These 2 sheds were also described by Gilbert Horel, a French chimpanzee hunter that Ed Hooper met in 1992. The sheds were used to house the chimpanzees in Lindy. Gilbert Horel was officially an employee of the Game and Fishery Service, but for almost 3 years, he actually worked exclusively for the Stanleyville Laboratory. To successfully implement such a hunt and capture operation, Horel called upon the best chimpanzee hunters, the pygmies. For over 3 years, an army of 200 men undertook some 120 hunting expeditions in the forest. Male specimens were killed. Only the females and babies were captured and brought back.
biso lokola batravailleur toyebaka makambo te okomela kaka bayei basali nini polio na bango wana baki kosala baopération wana biso mpe tokipe na yango te oyo azalaki koyeba obele infirmière ndakoki koyeba sekre wana.
What secrets is Eyrolle talking about? There is little left of the camp that can help us understand. In the jungle, only a few traces remain. A marking stone with some initials and a date, 1956. Some rusted steel beams. But there exist images of what Lindy used to look like. These are photographs taken in February 1957 by an American, Tom Norton, Kaprowski's right-hand man. They help date one of Kaprowski's trips to the Congo. This is not a fortuitous journey. It corresponds to an event, the first big influx of chimpanzees to Camp Lindy. More than 100 chimpanzees arrived in about 15 days, a fantastic number. For the first time, Kaprowski took the ferry to go and visit Lindy, the camp he had created. As any important visit, it was immortalized by a symbolic handshake between the two co-founders, Courtois and Kaprowski. A picture of 4 doctors surrounding the pioneer of the oral polio vaccine, in the middle of the jungle, far from the labs. Here is Ghislain Courtois, the director, Hilary Kaprowski, Paul Osterrieth, head of the Department of Virology, Tom Norton, Kaprowski's right-hand man, and Gaston Ninan, a microbiologist who would take part in Ruzizi's major vaccination campaign. Ninan and Osterrieth also appear on the photo of the research team at the Stanleyville Medical Lab in 1958. Seated to the right is Joseph Vandepitte, the very same who collected the L70 blood sample in Leopoldville and was standing in for the director, Ghislain Courtois, on a 6-month vacation.
Quand moi j'arrivais là, M. Kaprowski était déjà un enfant de la maison. Il avait une villa, il venait assez souvent. Hein. Non, moi je ne sais pas quelles étaient les relations. Je crois que M. Kaprowski, avec son vaccin en main, a dit il me faut un endroit où je peux maintenant le mettre en pratique. Et je crois qu'il n'a pas été très difficile de se faire inviter au Congo. Hein. Le Congo était un pays bien organisé à l'époque. On savait qu'il y avait ici un tout nouveau laboratoire. Et je crois qu'on a été très heureux de l'accueillir et de lui donner toutes les facilités voulues pour essayer son vaccin in vivo. Hein. Et je crois que dans l'ensemble, on décrit 1 million d'enfants qui ont été vaccinés à cette époque. Comme vous l'avez vu sur la photo dans le livre de Hooper, c'était un très grand et même un trop grand bâtiment, parce qu'on voulait en faire un laboratoire de recherche sur l'hépatite, sur la peste, et finalement, et par hasard aussi, sur la polio. Et quoique j'étais sur papier l'administrateur du laboratoire, je ne m'occupais pas de la gestion de tous les jours, j'étais au courant de la plupart des choses, et je me rappelle toujours que c'est avec plaisir que dimanche j'allais nourrir avec des bananes les chimpanzés du site de la Lindy. Et ce site était propriété du laboratoire et contenait à un certain moment jusqu'à 50 singes, surtout des singes donc attrapés localement, des chimpanzés donc, de la variété locale. Mais par simple observation, je peux vous dire quand même que je n'ai jamais entendu dire, ni jamais vu un acte un acte de tuerie sur un chimpanzé.
Yet in his book, Ed Hooper wrote about the killing of 400 chimpanzees. Eyrolle had told us that only the camp nurses knew the secrets. He led us to one of them, Joseph Limbaya, Lindy's chief nurse for the entire life of the camp. For the very first time in 48 years, he spoke.
Tungakiwana mobele pona ko tusalaka tutiaka mobele banyama yangu wana tuti banyama wana soko basengi yango mpona koboma yango tobumi yango. Nazalaka koboma mokolo moko na koboma mibale to misato. Koboma bango nakuingisa bango na nini wana na mashine wana nazalaki na yango. Mashine yango ezali boye bakangisi ye boye. Ale na kati ekingo nakamati makila nakotia na bokar na molangi moko boyo nakotia yango makila yango na ti. Nde nsima yango nasali autopsie. Nakosala autopsie nakokata awa. Nakati awa yoso nakobimisa foie. Foie ezali oyebi soyebi foie. Tozali kolongola yango. Misuni te, misuni yawa te. Mbuma yango yali kuna mibale kuna to kobenga rein. Nde docteur akoya na yango. Aye na yango na Kisangani awa na laboratoire pana kotinda na Amerika. Pana kotinda yango na Amerika.
Docteur nani oyo ozalaki kosala na ye muda Belgique?
Oyo nazali kosala na ye Polio Vaccine.
Joseph showed no hesitation. Paul Osterrieth was the one giving orders. But Osterrieth has always denied dealing in any way with the Lindi chimpanzees. Eyrolle also kept what he saw secret, but he agrees to testify.
Liboso nano basala bango autopsie. Alors ikoza soki nyama mine soki mitano mokolo yango kopesa bango biloko te. Mokolo mosusu nde baye babeti bango tonga. Tonga wana ezali pona bala lokola ponge bakomi lokola paralysé bazali susu makasi te mais bakufi te bazali susu makasi te. Nde sima yango balotolongoli baki kosala ba opération yango lokola tomoni awa bango na basuzevu baki kosala sima yango nde babwaki batokundi yango kolia te bwaka. Tango bakosala opération na nyama ezali ezali nano mobimba ekomona ekoloba.
So it was, like that day in Lindi, filmed by a team member and amateur cameraman. During his 6-month stay in Stanleyville, could Vandepitte ignore that the chimpanzees at Lindi were being systematically sacrificed? Joseph and Eyrole's revelations are extremely important and explain why such a secret surrounds Lindi. Not only were animals autopsied, some were dissected alive to collect their blood and organs. The main use of organs from living animals in those days was to make tissue culture, the necessary ingredient for vaccine production. Is that what the Lindi chimpanzee kidneys were used for? Back to Stanleyville, in search of the former lab workers.
Je suis engagé au laboratoire médical provincial à l'époque belge. C'était en 1956. J'ai travaillé au milieu des cultures Préparation donc des milliers d'écritures avec mon chef, M. Doupagne-Pierre. À l'époque, les gens de Kalindi dépendaient des laboratoires médicaux. Tous les produits et tous les matériels de recherche se trouvaient au laboratoire médical. Il y avait des chimpanzés au cas Linde là-bas, pour la recherche et tout consort. À l'époque, c'était docteur Courtois qui s'occupait avec ça. Au stérique, avant, on travaillait avec lui au département de microbiologie. Après, il est allé travailler au service de la virologie avec docteur Courtois ensemble. C'est là les nés. On travaillait avec des histoires de chimpanzés là-bas. Je crois qu'il est encore vivant. Il peut expliquer cette situation ici. Il était là. Ils travaillaient ensemble. Docteur Courtois, Ostérique, Madame Liégeois.
We were unable to speak with Paul Osterrieth, but we found Philippe's boss, Pierre Dupagne, who at the time was the chief technician in the Stanleyville laboratory.
Quand Paul Osterrieth est arrivé en Afrique, on ne parlait pas de culture de virus. Alors on s'y est mis tous à étudier un peu le problème pour essayer d'en faire. C'est comme ça qu'on a après fait la culture de virus en Afrique. C'est comme ça que Paul Osterrieth a appris la virologie. Il a appris vraiment dès le début, quoi. J'ai travaillé à la même table que lui pendant 2 ans et demi, 3 ans. Il était très fort. Haute intelligence, remarquable. On avait un très beau matériel de bactériologie, en tous les cas. Et quand vous avez déjà ce matériel de bactériologie, la culture de tissu, c'est pas bien compliqué après. Le tout, c'est de savoir travailler bien stérilement. Hein. C'est là que c'est très délicat. Parce que à cette époque-là, je ne sais pas pourquoi, on ne prenait pas de notes. Personne n'avait de notes. Ou personne ne voulait avoir de notes. Je ne sais pas. Il n'y avait rien du tout. Tant et si bien ce qu'on a fait exactement là-bas, moi, je ne sais pas très bien. À part quelques données bien spécifiques.
Yet Paul Osterrieth was categorical in his public denial before the Royal Society. It never would have occurred to me to risk human life and my own reputation on material prepared under such primitive conditions. I categorically deny that I ever did that. How can Osterrieth affirm that the most modern of the Belgian Congo laboratories was too primitive to make tissue culture? Like Dupagne, microbiologist Gaston Ninan gave another version. Ninan had spent 6 months in Belgium, just before the opening of the lab in 1957, perfecting tissue culture techniques. He was the first member of the team Ed Hooper met.
Now this is my handwritten transcript of the very first interview I did with Gaston Ninan in November 1992.
The virus was cultivated on kidney cells, chimpanzee kidney cells. At this time, the tissue culture was made in bottle like this.
Yes.
Comme ça. And this was at the beginning because the kidney cell and the kidney cell multiply easily. And it was a good substrate for the polio virus.
Oh, I see. So this is quite extraordinary. Now, in the end, he always retracts the chimpanzee kidney cells and just says, I don't know which type of monkey kidney. But the point is, he repeatedly says that they were making it on chimpanzee kidney. I had no choice when I wrote The River but to accept his retraction, to accept his final version of events. And Gaston Hénin is now dead. But I believe very firmly that the original version that he gave me was the correct one.
It is an astonishing revelation. For Gaston Hénin, there is no ambiguity. He talks very naturally of cultivating the polio virus on chimpanzee kidney tissue. So the Stanleyville Medical Laboratory was not so primitive after all. And this is probably the reason why a friend of Kaprowski, Fritz Deinhardt, a specialist in tissue culture, arrived in Stanleyville on February 1st, 1958, 3 weeks before the beginning of the great vaccination campaign of the Ruzizi. During 3 months, he did hepatitis research with Lindy chimpanzee tissue in Osterrieth's virology department. After his departure, Osterrieth sent 6 shipments of minced chimpanzee kidneys to him in Philadelphia, following a protocol established by Deinhardt. Ed Hooper found a copy in a US Army document. It is a precise description of how to prepare chimpanzee kidneys for tissue culture.
That one of the things they did was they attempted to grow the hepatitis virus in chimpanzee kidney cultures. And there's a very complete section about how they prepared those cultures. And what's described in the first place has all the necessary ingredients of a culture. Those kidneys were minced, they were cut up tinily with scissors. They added growth medium, in this case that was chimpanzee serum.
This is the key word, isologous. It means from the same species as the collected organ, in this case the chimpanzee. Why is this so important? In serum there are special cells, the macrophage.
A macrophage is a white blood cell, and it is the major target cell of SIVs and HIVs. What you have here is the information that automatically there would be macrophages in this culture. So we're talking here about the sacrifice of 400 chimps. So there's a very large likelihood that one or more of these chimpanzees was SIV infected. Probably rather a large number were SIV infected, especially because they were caged together and sometimes put in group cages at Lindy.
Deinhardt's report confirms Baiello's and Ninan's accounts. It is the only existing document that proves that in Stanleyville, a procedure existed to collect living organs. This contradicts both Osterrieth and Kaprowski's version of events.
Paul Osterrieth gives different accounts of whether kidneys ever were sent from his laboratory, from Stanleyville to Philadelphia. At one point he tells Stanley Plotkin, and he signs a document for Stanley Plotkin. This is a copy. This is an example of how the Plotkin Desmiter evidence was prepared. They send typed papers to the scientists in question. Presumably they've discussed things with them beforehand, I hope so. And they're invited to sign their names and date it at the bottom. And this one's rather interesting because in a handwritten entry at the very end, an entry which is different from the signatory, we read the following: I also want to state very clearly that I never sent chimpanzee kidneys to the Wistar Institute, Philadelphia, and it's signed Paul Osterrieth, February the 28th, year 2000. Well, elsewhere, in the Royal Society volume, he says exactly the opposite. Here he says, it's true that 6 minced chimpanzee kidneys were sent to the Wistar Institute at the request of Fritz Deinhardt. So, actually, within the same volume, you have Plotkin reporting Osterrieth saying one thing, and you have Osterrieth saying exactly the opposite. Now, what are we meant to believe about the reliability of the evidence from these people if they contradict themselves in different statements given a few months apart?
Why so many contradictions? Certainly the question of tissue culture is the key to this mystery. How could more than 1 million vaccine doses be given without being made locally? Jacques Kanyama was one of Osteritha's assistants. From February 1958 on, he worked in the Department of Virology's sterile chamber.
Biso ngai naibaki kaka o vaccin naibisi oke asala kao ya glyceline po batindira ka yeke epidemie moko ya bana mike bimina ka ya rife gauche ka lukusa nde a prepare ke yango ye moko kasi abengaki moto po tango aiko prepare tomonaki ndenge ya solution ya salaki te toyebi obele kokende kovaccine bato na ngai na ye nde tokendaka na rive gauche.
Au département de la virologie, on fabriquait des vaccins parce que après la fabrication, on met dans des flacons de 50 millilitres et on met des étiquettes aussi. Ce n'était pas une chose à cassette. Il y avait des étiquettes et on avait écrit aussi les vaccins anti-polio.
Ezali vaccin ya kotia na munoko ya maladi nini?
Mais soki otai de près koki kosala vaccin ezalaki kosala vaccin ya poliomelite ya bana mike.
Bino boyebaki ndenge nini kasi lokola ye pe bande kosalaka ba vaccin ye docteur Osterite?
Parce que ngai nayebi te ye nde asalaka parce que ntango ye abengisaka ngai ke yaka oprepare baflacon atindaki yo po osukula yango tia sterile tokotia vaccin kuna ezali vaccin aprepare yango atie na mwa nini moko buye ya sterile nde ngai nakendaki nde kotiatia na parce que soki eutaki mosika ekoki koya bongo te ezali ke ye nde moto afabrike ke yango.
Ça, je peux vous dire la vérité que à l'époque belge, vous savez bien que nous étions colonisés, mon cher. Hein? Si les deux blancs comme ça s'entretiennent, vous ne pouvez pas être là pour savoir qu'est-ce qui se passe. Hein?
C'est évident que le Chappell est intervenu dans la composition du vaccin anti-polio. Mais à quel stade, à quel niveau, moi je n'en sais rien. Je ne vois pas pourquoi on aurait fait tant d'histoires que ça avec les chimpanzés, si ça n'avait pas été pour s'en servir pour avoir un but scientifique en fait. Mais c'était avant tout un but scientifique pour lequel on les employait. Non, moi, j'ai plus rien à dire. Je vais parler assez comme ça. C'est parler de toi-même.
Two months after our meeting, Ed Hooper saw Pierre Dupagne one more time. This is the recording of their conversation.
Of making the culture.
The culture was sterile. I put the culture sterile. I was sterile to Anina. I don't know. To do what I don't know.
This tissue culture was made from the chimpanzees. Let me ask you one last thing, Pierre, before I go. How many times then would you say that you were making the sterile tissue culture from chimps for Osterite? A long time.
Finally, one of the last living Belgian witnesses has the courage to reveal what others want to keep secret. Tissue culture from chimpanzee kidneys were prepared in Stanleyville to make polio vaccine. Why should it be a surprise?
That routinely, all the people who were making oral polio vaccine used one particular method. They didn't send gallons of their vaccine overseas. That would have been logistically a very, very difficult process. They sent a small amount. They sent typically one flask of maybe 100 cc of vaccine. And each of those polio vaccine makers had another laboratory, the laboratory near to where the vaccination was taking place, grow the vaccine up in locally available tissue culture. So Albert Sabin sent his vaccine to places like Hungary and the Soviet Union in 1957, and it was grown up locally in laboratories in Budapest, in Moscow, in Leningrad, and so forth. From Paris, Pierre Lepine from the Pasteur Institute, he sent his vaccines out to places such as Brazzaville in Congo-Brazzaville. It was then in French Equatorial Africa. And there again, apparently, they grew up the vaccine virus in the locally available tissue culture. There, the commonest monkey was Cercopithecus nictitans. What's interesting, of course, is that whereas the actual vaccines had been very carefully tested, they were attenuated, they were safe for feeding to humans, what hadn't apparently been well tested at all was the impact of these different substrates. I see no evidence of people examining the cells from the different monkeys they were using for the final passage to see whether they had any contraindications for humans. It was an extraordinary lapse, and everyone was doing it.
Between 1957 and 1959, 1 million people received Kaprowski's chat experimental vaccine.
Haraturarika bakaduhamagara, katurarika tukagenda, tukigaba tukazinduka, ntihari hafi, tukigaba tukanarayo, gaca tugatonda mu gatondo, tonda imirongo, nuko ntihagire ucererwa, ntihagire usubirwa, abana baterurwa ku bitugu bakagenda baterurwa bigendera bakigendera, yego niko babikoresha. Ko ntibagirira hafi, twebwe twari kure y'aho turi, twarigaba. Abakozi nibo babyuka cyane kuko bazi kuzinduka, abandi twarigaba tukararayo. Kwari urucanco rukomeye cyane, atawusiba na buhoro buhoro. Candara
udacandazwe nawe uwanse kugenda
baramuhana wari kwanga, ngo bariye n'abana ko bagenda babateruye abaterurwa bigororokamwo rwose ntawasiba, ari irarika rikomeye rwose.
Urumva hageze nk'umuntu ari nka kuja ku rucanco, urumva hariho abatware baramenya bati mu rugo kwa naka ntibagiye ku rucanco, urumva haraho ibintu nyene mugabo ntabo bapfunga, ariko barabahimiriza rwose ku buryo bose bashobora kugenda, barakurikirana cyane.
These trials were criticized by the World Health Organization. In a confidential letter dated November the 11th, 1958, one of its members wrote, "The Belgian Congo trial was, in my opinion, an excellent example of how such large-scale studies should not be carried out."
It would be absolutely unfair if responsibility for this sequence of events, for the making of the vaccine in chimpanzee cells, was to fall solely on the shoulders of Paul Osterrieth. He was the corporal or sergeant, but we must look for the generals here. His boss, Ghislaine Courtois, the head of the medical laboratory in Stanleyville, clearly approved this course of action. There's no doubt about that. And just a few months before he began making the vaccine in chimp cells, Osterrieth was being trained in tissue culture techniques at the Wistar Institute. He was called there at the specific request of Hilary Kaprowski. The person with overall responsibility for this sequence of events, without a doubt, is Dr. Kaprowski. Without his approval, without his direction, this sequence of events would not have taken place.
I have no knowledge about it. I don't think the Belgians have knowledge about it. You should take his evidence with a grain of salt.
I mean, is it possible that this was done without you knowing, that chimpanzee kidneys were used without you knowing about it?
No, there was no possibility to do something like that.
Can we be satisfied with such an answer when it is not backed up by any proof nor any studies? Can we forget that 1 million people received an experimental vaccine that may be linked to the origins of the AIDS pandemic? From our inquiry in the Congo, thanks to our witnesses and Ed Hooper's documents, we have discovered how the Stanleyville laboratory could produce the chat vaccine. It would have been perfectly normal, but the Lindy camp was something unique in the fact that its chimpanzees were used in producing the vaccine. But does this resolve the question of the origins of AIDS? Final proof can only be the testing of a vaccine sample actually used in the Congo. But until now, none has been found. As long as the key actors of this story keep silent, there will always be a doubt. During the inauguration of the Stanleyville laboratory in 1957, Kaprowski made a speech about his polio research. The last sentence is foreboding. With these facts in mind, we must conclude that the price that each of us is asked to pay at this time in order to safeguard the comfort of future generations is, in truth, negligible. Three years after the Royal Society conference, where are we? The main scientific argument used to destroy the oral polio vaccine hypothesis, the dating of the HIV virus to the 1930s, has been challenged by new studies. The true scientific debate on the origins of AIDS is still to come. Today, most governments are cutting research funding, leaving pharmaceutical companies to establish their own medical priorities with limited public oversight. Contaminated blood, mad cow disease, and the emergence of new unexplained diseases are only a few examples pointing to the fact that little has changed. As Bill Hamilton warned, if the relationship between pharmaceutical groups and science is not challenged, other catastrophes may already be in the making.